Welcome back, everyone. So in the last lesson, we learned about using our provider as well as our consumer when it comes to using context. We also learned a little bit about leveraging local state in order to propagate changes into our context provider so our consumers can get a dynamically changing value. However, in the next two lessons, we are going to start exploring some more complex versions on patterns of how to use context. In this one, we're going to talk about how we can actually replace our toggle hidden inside of a higher level component while passing the actual function that toggles the context value itself in the children of that component. So we'll see what that looks like with this header component and the cart icon component. The reason why is because our cart icon component right now is what toggles the cart's hidden value inside of our Redux. So we want to replace and replicate this exact same process, except using the context API. And as a springboard, we're going to take the concepts that we learn in today's lesson and apply them into a much larger, higher order component style of building out a bigger provider in order to better understand other more complicated patterns we can use with context. But let's start with something more basic. All we want to do in this lesson is have our hidden value moved into our cart context. And that cart context we have to build. So let's first build a cart context. So inside of your source and contexts, I want you to make a new folder called cart. And inside of cart, you're going to make a new cart.context.js. Now, the actual cart context is going to be the same thing that we've done so far with all of our other contexts. We are going to import create context from React. And then what we're going to say is that cart context is equal to create context, except now what we're going to instantiate as the default value is an object, because we need to set both a value that we want the context to hold, but also the function that will end up updating that value. So in our case, we're trying to set a cart hidden value. So we'll just call it hidden, and by default, it will be false. Or sorry, actually by default, it's true because the cart is hidden by default. After we have this, we need to actually create the function that will toggle the hidden. But here we only want a default value for that toggle. We don't actually want to write the function yet because the function is going to be defined inside of a component's local state. The same reason that we had to do it with our user context is the same reason why we have to do it with our cart context. Because the parent component, we need to leverage its local state changes in order for these changes to propagate into our context. I'll talk about this more once we actually see it, just so that everyone fully understands what it is that we're trying to do. But here we're going to say toggle hidden is equal to some anonymous function that does nothing. And the reason we want to do this is because the default value of a toggle hidden should be an empty function. If we ever invoke this function from the context and there is no other function defined, like there's no new function defined for toggle hidden, we don't want an error to be thrown. Because if the default value of this is null, you cannot invoke a null object. So we're going to put an empty function whenever we need to use a function. Now what we'll do is we will export this out as the default value. And then we're going to pull this into our header component. So inside of our header component, simply import in that new context that we made. So our cart context. And now that you have the cart context, we're going to need to leverage our local state in order to actually propagate changes into that cart context value. The same way that we did it with our app.js when we had to create a set state for current user. So what we'll do here is we will instantiate our values using the useState hook. And what we want to do is we want to store that hidden value on our local state of our header component. And the reason why we want to do this is because the cart icon is a child of this component. Therefore, we need the state changes to be in the parent. As you might have noticed at this point, after all of these hierarchy component lessons we've done, changes need to propagate from top down. So let me actually look at this diagram so we have a better understanding of it. Let's say this is our header component. And let's say this is our cart icon component. And this is our cart dropdown component. This cart dropdown relies on the hidden context value that we just set in order for it to either display or hide. The display or hide occurs at this component level, the header. So the header is actually the component that needs to have access to the context provider, because we need to put the value of whether or not it's hidden or not at some level where we can both access setting it from one of its children, which is our cart icon, but also the value that it'll end up being, which is the hidden Boolean value inside of this cart dropdown. So by putting it in the common ancestor, we need to leverage this component's local state changes whenever we call setState, which will propagate and set the new value in both the consumer but also in the provider. Now, if that sounds confusing, just watch me code this out and then hopefully it'll make more sense, because this part is definitely a little bit more confusing when you're looking at React for the first time. This context is really a much greater feature when you have a really solid understanding of how JavaScript actually renders and updates its components. So what we need to do here is we need to leverage local state. And we're going to get both a hidden value and a toggle hidden value from useState, and then setting the default value to whatever it was that our default value was in our cart context. So here we want to say that it's true. Now, instead of toggle hidden, actually this is set hidden. And we are now no longer going to leverage passing it in through Redux. So just remove this, and we'll remove those Redux bindings later. The reason why we need this set hidden value is because we're going to write our own toggle hidden value here. And this is going to be a function that when called, we'll call set hidden, where we set the value to the opposite of the current hidden value. So as we know with useState, we instantiate a new local state where the hidden property is equal to true. And then we have access to this set hidden function that allows us to set this property. So what we'll do is we'll declare this new function, which is an anonymous function, that whenever it gets called, we'll just simply set the hidden value to the opposite value of what it currently is. Very simple. But this toggle hidden function is what we're going to pass as the new toggle hidden value inside of this cart context. And because we need access to that function inside of cart icon, which will be the component that ends up consuming our cart context that we're instantiating, we are going to wrap this cart icon component inside of our new context. Now, you might be wondering, doesn't the header component right here also need to leverage that hidden property on our cart context? Because this hidden property is what it is we're trying to set in the first place. And this is where we actually leverage it in order to hide or show the cart dropdown. Well, you would be correct. But instead of using the actual context value, we need to remember that what we're doing is we are going to end up passing this local state hidden value into the context, which will then be consumed inside of the application. So what we're really sharing is actually the local state value of toggle hidden and hidden inside of the header component around our application. And by doing so, we're leveraging local state changes inside of the header component in order to propagate those changes into the context so that anyone that needs it is able to do so. That's the whole point with setting up a function that allows us to set context inside of this header component anywhere in the application. You can almost see it as if the context is just the vehicle that allows us to transfer both this toggle hidden function and this hidden value on our local state around any of the children inside of the header component. So no matter how many children nested deep any component is inside of our header, as long as we wrap it with the appropriate cart provider, then we're able to access the context value where we're storing both the hidden value and the toggle hidden value in the local state of our header component. So if that's still confusing, let's actually see it in action. So our cart icon needs to access our toggle cart hidden. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap it with our cart context.provider. And the value key that we're going to pass in is going to be an object where the value of hidden will go to hidden and the value of toggle hidden will go to our toggle hidden. So we're replacing these two values here with our local state values for hidden and toggle hidden. And now inside of a cart icon, we can access this toggle hidden function that we defined here in order to set the hidden of local state inside of header. And we do that by consuming our cart icon component. So what we'll say is we need the use context hook inside of cart icon. And then we also need to import in our cart context. And now we just convert this functional component to have a explicit return, and we'll say const toggle hidden, which is what we're destructuring off, is going to be equal to use context of our cart context. Now let's get rid of this Redux binding that we have here. Because we're not using Redux anymore, we are now using our context API. Now inside of our cart icon, we are pulling in the toggle hidden value. And the toggle hidden value of our cart context is being set as the toggle hidden function of our header component, because we pass that in along with our hidden value into our cart context provider. So if that makes sense, you'll understand what it is that we really did here, because what we're doing is we're just trying to pass access to this function inside of a context so we can use it anywhere in the application that's nested inside of this provider. So let's actually see whether or not it works. So now if we hit this, we'll see that we're toggling it and we're not firing that Redux action anymore, because now we're leveraging our context API and that new toggle hidden function that we wrote. So hopefully that makes sense, because we are going to extrapolate on this concept pretty deeply. In order for us to pass around any of the toggle values into our application, if we want to set values inside of our context, we're going to have to leverage a very similar pattern. We need a component at a very high parent level that has access to local state. And then we're going to pass those functions and those local state values into the context, which we can then share across the application so that those components can pull in those functions and those values and use them freely. That's the whole idea with this context pattern. So with this, let's actually move on to a more advanced context provider pattern. If this is confusing, we'll definitely take a deeper look at it in the next lesson as well, so don't worry. So I'll see you in the next lesson.